was notably referred to as Liberation Day.
Liberation Day.
Yeah, that's when the reciprocal tariffs were officially implemented. The primary objective, as stated, was pretty ambitious. Basically to revitalize American industry and lessen the country's reliance on the trade practices of other nations.
And this concept of reciprocity is central here, right? The idea was to charge countries roughly half the tariff rate they were already imposing on goods coming from the United States.
Exactly.
China's tariffs, which were up at 67%, would be reduced to 34%. The EU's 39% would fall to 20%, and Vietnam's really high, and 90% would see a decrease to 46%. Even tariffs on automobiles were specifically mentioned. The U.S. moving towards a 25% tariff on foreign-made cars.
And it's also important to recall there was a minimum baseline tariff, 10%, applied to other countries as part of this new framework. These tariffs went into effect, immediately after the announcement. The intention was definitely for a swift and noticeable impact.
Okay, now, let's address a point that might surprise some people.
Yeah.
When we talk about these tariffs, direct energy commodities like crude oil, natural gas, the refined fuels we use every day, they're actually exempt.
That's right.
About Venezuelan oil also sort of touched on this by discussing a proposed but ultimately separate tariff on that specific type of crude. So your gas prices at the pump aren't directly affected by these specific tariffs.
That's correct. And the decision to exempt those core energy commodities likely reflects a desire to, prevent immediate price shocks for domestic consumers. However, and this is where things get really interesting for our discussion today, this exemption doesn't mean the broader energy sector is untouched. Not at all. The indirect consequences are actually quite profound.
Absolutely. The real impact is being felt in related sectors, particularly when we dig into the world of battery storage and the critical minerals essential for making them. That these tariffs on imports, especially from major players like China and the EU, who, as we just said, face significant tariff rates under this reciprocal system, are going to drive up the costs of crucial materials.
Think about it. Lithium, cobalt, those vital rare earth elements. They're the fundamental ingredients for battery storage tech. So when the import costs for these materials increase, which they will under these tariffs, it just naturally follows that the U.S.'s ambitious plans for expanding energy storage capacity.
Which is so vital for renewables.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So vital for effectively integrating intermittent sources like solar and wind. Well, those plans could face a significant slowdown. For instance, a 25% tariff on imported lithium compounds could add a substantial amount to the cost per kilowatt hour of battery production.
Wow.
Yeah, potentially making large-scale grid storage projects less economically viable, at least in the near term, and maybe even jeopardizing the administration's targets for renewable energy integration.
And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because while these higher tariffs on battery manufacturers, especially those in China and Europe, are intended to incentivize domestic U.S. production, that's the main goal.
Right, the onshoring push.
The reality is that building up those domestic industries to scale takes time.
Yeah.
So in the interim, we're probably looking at higher prices for consumers as the cost of imported batteries goes up.
This situation really underscores the importance of supply chain resilience. The U.S. might actively pursue diversifying its critical mineral sources. We could see a strengthening of trade relationships with countries like Australia, Canada, various nations in Africa,
Okay.
all in an effort to reduce reliance on potentially higher cost imports from countries facing these new tariffs. A key concern has been the concentration of critical mineral processing in just a few nations.
Yeah.
These tariffs sort of force the U.S. to explore geographically diverse sources.
Which is probably good long-term security-wise, but maybe not cost-wise initially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It could introduce new logistical complexities and initial cost premiums. Definitely something to watch.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to another vital piece of the energy transition, solar energy. The higher tariffs on solar panel imports, where, again, China and Europe are huge global suppliers. Those tariffs are likely to result in increased costs for solar installations across the U.S., which could, in turn, slow down the pace at which we're deploying domestic solar power.
Yeah, and when we consider this in the context of broader U.S. energy policy, it's crucial to remember the incentives packed into the Inflation Reduction Act. Specifically, those designed to boost domestic manufacturing of solar components.
Right, the IRA.
Those incentives could indeed act as a counterbalance to the cost increases from the tariffs. However, there are still ongoing concerns about the reliability and diversity of the solar supply chain. That remains a significant factor.
It's also kind of fascinating to consider whether these tariffs might maybe inadvertently create new opportunities for alternative solar technologies.
That's an interesting point.
Innovations like perovskite and thin-film solar cells. These are newer types of solar tech using different materials than traditional silicon.
Right, potentially lower manufacturing costs, more flexibility.
Yeah, so as traditional silicon-based panels face higher import costs, maybe these alternatives become comparatively more attractive for investment and development.
It's definitely possible. It could accelerate R&D in those areas.
Hmm.
Now, what's really noteworthy is the global response we're seeing to these U.S. tariff policies. Europe, for example, seems to be significantly stepping up its focus and investment in achieving greater energy independence and expanding its energy storage capabilities.
We saw some concrete examples of this, didn't we? It's substantial investments, I think, by the Swedish firm EQT and various private equity firms.
Yes, exactly. Pouring money into bolstering European energy storage solutions and grid infrastructure. And Drax's acquisition of Harmony Energy Income Trust, HATE-IA, that also signals a strong commitment to deploying large-scale battery storage across the continent.
And it wasn't just them, right? Big players like Blackstone, sovereign wealth funds, they're increasing investments in European airports, energy infrastructure. It really underscores a strategic shift towards decentralized and renewable energy expansion.
Definitely. And when we talk about decentralized energy in Europe, what does that practically look like?
Good question. In Europe, decentralized energy often translates to a greater emphasis on localized generation. Think rooftop solar panels combined with home battery storage, feeding into more resilient local grids, sometimes called microgrids.
Ah.
It also involves larger-scale, community-owned renewable projects and more localized control over energy resources, basically reducing dependence on those huge, centralized power plants and extensive transmission lines.
That paints a clear picture, and it seems this push for energy independence might lead to some interesting international collaborations, maybe ones we wouldn't expect.
Indeed. There's the very real possibility of stronger collaborative efforts between the European Union and China, particularly in those crucial areas of battery and solar technology development. EU and China teaming up.
Yeah, this kind of alliance could emerge as a direct response to the U.S. tariffs, effectively creating a significant competitive force in the global clean energy market.
And we should also remember China's historical responses to trade tensions. China had previously cut back its imports of U.S. energy commodities because of earlier trade disputes. It shows they're willing and able to diversify their energy partnerships.
Right, they've done it before.
So if we consider the broader implications for global supply chains, regions like Africa and South America could potentially become more prominent as key production hubs for solar components.
Why them specifically?
Well, it would likely be driven by their natural resource availability and potentially more favorable trade policies compared to the tariffs now in place with the United States, kind of shifting the manufacturing map.
Even the Middle East is showing a change in focus, isn't it? Interest in solar energy among oil exporting nations there. They're strategically planning to diversify their economies for the long term, recognizing the global shift towards cleaner energy sources. Makes sense.
And we shouldn't overlook the immediate concerns raised by industries within the U.S. itself, highlighted worries from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation.
Ah, yes, the auto sector.
Not just about the direct impact of tariffs on car parts and costs, but also about the very real possibility of retaliatory tariffs being imposed by Europe.
Oof, yeah. Tit for tat.
It just illustrates that the effects of these U.S. policies are expected to be wide-ranging and potentially detrimental to multiple sectors of the economy, not just energy.
So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, these U.S. tariffs seem to be significantly accelerating a global trend towards greater domestic energy independence, especially in strategically important areas like battery storage and solar manufacturing.
Yeah, it feels like nations are clearly prioritizing the security and resilience of their own energy supply chains, aiming to reduce their reliance on external actors.
But this strong push for national self-sufficiency could have some significant drawbacks. It has the potential to put a strain on established global energy cooperation frameworks.
How so?
Well, it could potentially slow down the pace of innovation in the sector if everyone's focused inward. As countries adapt to this new tariff landscape, we might see the formation of new international alliances, like the EU-China one we mentioned, and just a fundamental reshaping of how collaborative efforts in energy tech development and deployment happen globally.
Significant movements of capital. We're seeing substantial investments from private equity firms and sovereign wealth funds flowing into European energy infrastructure projects.
Right, really indicating a long-term strategic bet on decentralized and renewable energy solutions across the continent. Specifically, EQT's latest fund, which significantly exceeded its initial target, is specifically focused on driving decarbonization and fostering the growth of decentralized energy solutions. That really emphasizes Europe's strategic direction.
And here in the U.S., the CBS4 local transcript mentions some major companies: Apple, SoftBank, Oracle, NVIDIA, TSMC, announcing significant investments in American manufacturing facilities.
Right, big names.
And interestingly, the implementation of these tariffs was explicitly cited as one of the contributing factors influencing these investment decisions. It seems companies are actively incorporating these new trade regulations into their long-term strategic planning.
So it really does seem that these tariffs are acting as a significant catalyst, prompting companies to reassess their global manufacturing and supply chain strategies and potentially bringing production back to the U.S. to mitigate the impact of those import costs.
Yeah, exactly what they were designed to do, in theory.
So to sort of wrap up our deep dive, it's pretty evident that these U.S. tariffs, while again, not directly targeting traditional energy commodities, are fundamentally reshaping the dynamics of global energy trade. They are doing this by significantly impacting crucial growth sectors, like battery storage and solar energy, primarily through the increased costs of essential raw materials and components.
And we're clearly seeing significant shifts in investment patterns, right? There's this strong movement towards strengthening domestic production capabilities within the U.S., but also coupled with a parallel and, frankly, robust push for energy independence and infrastructure development across Europe.
Yeah. And these policies are also likely to foster new forms of international collaboration, maybe unexpected ones, and could pave the way for the emergence of alternative supply chains and technology partnerships in the global energy sector.
And that brings us to a final point for you, our listeners, to consider. In light of all the shifts we've discussed, the drive for domestic production, Europe's accelerated push for energy independence, the potential formation of new global alliances, how might the overall balance of power in global energy innovation and supply chains evolve in the coming years?
Yeah, what novel technologies or maybe unexpected international partnerships
They have all the solar power that they need.
Using the solar power to superheat and vaporize the
The
town.
grid system has three main parts. First is generation, where electricity is
Absolutely.
produced. Next is transmission, which carries and transports electricity over long distances. Finally, there is distribution, the stage where electricity reaches and powers our devices and appliances. Along the way, transformers are used to step up and down the voltage for efficient transmission
Source of
and
energy
safety.
lies beneath us. The heat, constantly emanating from our planet's 9,000-degree core. But until very recently, we could only capture it in the few places it rises as steam from natural hot springs, like the geysers in the Mayacamas Mountains of Northern California, the world's largest complex of geothermal stations capable of powering all of nearby San Francisco. Now, a series of wise government investments and scientific breakthroughs have dramatically lowered the costs of efficiently drilling way down to tap this 24/7 power source that's available in pretty much every state in America.
The Department of Energy project to generate electricity anywhere in the world. We can drill anywhere and find enough heat, but unfortunately those rocks don't have the permeability, the cracks, that allow for water to circulate through them and extract the heat. So the goal of this project is to create a reservoir, a fractured volume that we can inject water into and then extract the water after it's heated up. It's the first time a project like this is being developed to learn how to make a reservoir where none existed naturally.
Whereas conventional geothermal generation needs underground reservoirs in contact with hot rocks to send steam to the surface, enhanced geothermal systems create their own by boring thousands of feet deep to their target, the rock layer that is constantly as hot as an oven between 300 and 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Once at this target depth, engineers inject fluid at high pressure to create a network of fractures, which essentially act as a reservoir into which they inject a constant flow of water, which rapidly heats up and rises through the second well as steam, spinning a turbine and generating electricity. Over 95% of the water is captured and sent back down. Plus, the amount of fluid in the system is completely adjustable, turning EGS into an on-demand electricity source, the role we now rely on natural gas plants for.